Okay, so we have our panelists here, two that you've already met, Christiana Figueres and Roger Pulwarty, and let me introduce the others. John Firth, what hat do you wear and what do you bring to this particular discussion?
Well, my staff are in the audience actually here today, so I'm going to have to be careful what I do say, because I'm sure they'll have a different view of me. But I'm CEO of a risk management consultancy we set up just over 10 years ago now, focusing on adaptation. We've worked in over 60 countries now, developing and developed, and public and private sector. So we feel we have a pretty good view on what's happening globally around the world on adaptation and some of the responses. But one of the key things for us is focusing on action and implementation. And a lot of the discussion so far has been about planning, and actually the time's to do something now.
So you are an action man, and you are an action man particularly involved in private finance. That's one of your specialists.
The private sector is a big part of our work, and it's one of the things I perhaps get a chance to talk about a little bit later about the private sector's the untapped resource we're not touching yet.
Mark Watts, what hat are you wearing today?
I think I only have one hat. I'm Mark Watts. I'm the Executive Director of C40, which is an organisation that brings together the leaders of the world's largest and greatest cities, mostly sharing best practice between those city leaders on how they tackle climate change, but also increasingly providing a collective voice for mayors to take the stage around the global efforts to tackle climate change.
And finally, Deborah Roberts.
I'm not entirely certain what hat I wear, because I think, as Christiana indicated and Roger confirmed in his presentation, the range of challenges we face are going to require us all to do extraordinary things and work well outside of our comfort zone. So I think I'm part of a growing band of people, many of whom are in this room, who work at the nexus of practice, policy, and science. So my day job is I'm a local government practitioner. I'm down in the trenches trying to save an African city from underdevelopment and the impacts of climate change. I also dabbled in the policy arena. I've been part of the climate negotiations. And my new nighttime job is in the sciences. I'm now the co-chair of Working Group 2 for the Sixth Assessment Report.
Now let me start then with you, Deborah. Let's look at the challenges. What for you are the main challenges that we need to address, that this conference needs to address?
Right. Again, and I'm going to feed off what Christiana and Roger said. You know, if I think about the global climate change challenge, quite frankly, you either go big or you go home. And in terms of climate change adaptation, what that really means, and I'm sure Mark is going to back me up with this, is that you go urban. We already know that we live on a planet of cities. 54% of us live in urban areas. We know that we're going to add about 2.5 billion people to the urban population by the middle of the century. They're not going to be living in Rotterdam or any of the great cities that Mark represents. They're going to be living in small, informal cities that are emerging in Africa and Asia. And we know that as cities pull together people, they're also pulling together economies and infrastructure. So we know that our battle for sustainable development is going to be effectively won or lost in those urban spaces. So Christiana told us the big challenge is in 5 years, we've got to bend that climate curve. We're only going to bend that climate curve if we get all of the cities around the world, north, south, formal, informal, large and small, to tackle what we identify as the 4 big urban challenges of the century. Climate change adaptation, climate change mitigation, disaster risk reduction, of course, poverty alleviation, and underdevelopment. The point is we can come to meetings like these and pat ourselves on the back for the Paris Agreement, for the Sustainable Development Objectives, but let's not lose sight of what the huge elephant in the room. We still do not have a clear implementation path from those global agreements down to locally contextualized action that makes sense. That's the missing piece in our jigsaw puzzle. So what is the charge for us over these 4 days? We're going to have to mine the huge amounts of information you're all going to bring to the table to pull out those key building blocks that are going to allow us not only to implement the profoundly important global policy that Christiana has put on the table through the Paris Agreement, but is also going to allow us to link that very effectively to locally contextualized action in places that are largely informal, that have evolving forms of governance, where there are very few skills and resources. And that tail end of the challenge, because I'm sure Mark is going to talk to the upper end of the challenge, is very difficult because action in the trenches is largely being done in an ad hoc way through urban experimentation by local level champions supported by local level communities. So the real challenge I put out to you all today is, how do we use Adaptation Futures 2016 to find that implementation pathway back into the trenches, so we can systematically tackle adaptation in these very unconventional urban spaces, where we can embrace informality, where we can look at traditional forms of governance and knowledge and can utilize those in a way to empower local communities and local governments to improve well-being and equity. That, for me, is the broad landscape of our challenge for these 4 days.
Okay, Mark, how do you square that up? Because obviously you're focused on cities, but what for you are the challenges?
Well, I very much agree with Deborah, and we're, in our membership, it's 80 big cities representing about 600 million people, mostly based on the coast or on deltas or on rivers, highly vulnerable to the growing impacts of climate change. And yet, less than half of our members have a member of staff dedicated to climate adaptation. And these are the biggest cities in the world. So first and foremost, there's a challenge of resource. And that's connected actually to a second challenge, which is the need to be able to make the case for the joining together action on mitigation and adaptation. And we experience that as an organisation in a very real sense, in that we're largely philanthropically funded, very generously so, mostly by Western donors, but they don't want to fund adaptation work. So we are funding action in the global south on mitigation, but in the places that are most need help around adaptation, we don't have resource to support around that. And conversely, in many of the Western cities, well-funded, wealthy cities, increasing they're feeling a choice between action on adaptation and mitigation, and are likely to be shifting towards adaptation when what we really need them to do in those heavy emitting cities is to be cutting their emissions for the good of the world as a whole. The third thing, I think, though, which is still the case, despite the extraordinary work that Christiana and others did to bring that wonderful agreement together in Paris in December, when we survey our members, they still tell us there's the need to win the argument about climate change, the need to win the argument to dedicate resources to adapting to problems that the population still perceive as being risks that they don't really understand in the future, notwithstanding. And we survey our members every couple of years. In just the last 2 years, the numbers of cities that say that they're already experiencing the negative effects of climate change has gone from 50% to 70%. But notwithstanding that, the mayors still tell us they're struggling to win the argument. So I think more and more our ability, the evidence base to show that action on climate change will also deliver short-term benefits economically and socially, and indeed that action on adaptation and mitigation has twin benefits, is what we need to help them be able to take more action.
And is that partly because the perception is that adaptation is extremely costly for cities, whereas the perception is that mitigation is less costly?
I think certainly it's the perception that there are large upfront costs for adaptation and you don't see the benefits for a long time, and indeed you're hedging against risk, whereas it's much easier to measure the immediate benefit of the mitigation efforts. You can see the emissions inventory going down and the emissions haven't been reduced.
So there's a major problem in all societies of short-termism, because politicians are only in it for as long as they can be elected, I guess. Let's come to you now. What's your major challenges? And I think on the business side.
Well, I think one of the concerns I have I mean, we've done a lot of work on national adaptation planning for countries, and I mentioned earlier we've done a lot of work for the private sector. But it's interesting when we look at national adaptation planning, many countries are still seeing this as an environmental issue, and actually climate change isn't. It's an economic and societal issue. And the challenge we have is that the lead ministries in many countries are ministries of environment, and to be honest, that's not where this rests. It's ministries of finance. And unless you have ministries of finance owning climate change, you are not going to get implementation of action. You're not going to get that decision-making on sharing and apportioning scarce resources, particularly financial. So one of the big challenges we have is working with countries and getting them to understand they have an internal institutional issue they have to overcome. The second thing is allied to that, and again, it's that a lot of adaptation work has tended to involve the private sector as somebody you talk to, as a stakeholder, but not necessarily mainstream to the issues. And when we look around the world, I don't know of any country where the GDP of that country is not private sector focused. I think Roger mentioned earlier in his presentation about we have to have economically sustainable countries. If you don't have growing economies and economies that can pay for resilience and pay for adaptation and pay for developmental goals, then you're not going to succeed. And the GDP comes from the private sector. So we have to pull the private sector into decision-making as part of the team, not as an adjunct at a later date to have a communication with. And I'll give you just two practical examples of some of the challenges we face. I'll ask all of you, go back and look at your own national adaptation planning work and look in there and see how many references there are to the words economy, business, private sector, and how many pages are devoted in your national adaptation plan to the private sector. We did a rough trawl of just a suite of national adaptation plans. We struggled to find any national adaptation plan that got more than a couple of pages. Now, that's an unbalanced plan if you've not thought about the economy. And that's pretty critical because it's the private sector that will deliver the investment, and it's the private sector that will deliver adaptation in terms of many of the responses, because it's the private sector that delivers most of our goods and services that we all consume. And one final last example of some of the challenges that this sort of lack of coordination, understanding within governments about how we involve the private sector. We've just done some work for the World Bank Public-Private Insurance Advisory Facility, which looks at public-private partnerships on infrastructure. And around the world, cities can't afford to self-finance infrastructure. We all understand that. And public-private partnerships are seen as a way forward. They have problems, they have faults, but they also have benefits. We looked at 16 countries, developing and developed. All of those countries had some form of national adaptation plan or national adaptation strategy. Very clear what they had to do. All those 16 countries also had a legal framework setting out how PPPs would work. Not one of those countries had a PPP that talked about climate change. What does that mean? It means you're giving private sector a mixed message, but more importantly, it means you're investing in failure, because PPPs are about infrastructure, may have 25, 50-year lifetimes. You're designing and paying for something that you've not taken resilience into account. That is a classic maladaptation and misadministration of governments. And that's some of the challenge we face by not pulling the private sector in day one.
It's interesting you say about the bringing together, making sure that the Ministry of Finance is involved. I always remember the parallel perhaps is in vaccines, where there was very poor vaccine performance in some countries. And it was only when the Minister of Finance was locked in a room with the Minister of Health, together with somebody from the UN, that finally things started to move. So there is a real importance there. And of course it is the insurers who have those major funds that are available for infrastructure. Christiana and Rob, anything you want to add to Christiana first, the challenges? Although you've already expressed them very eloquently.
I think, one of the conundrums that I think we need to deal with is the fact that, and this may sound heretical in this room, but for all of the reasons that we've heard here, most often we cannot pursue climate action for the purpose of climate. Because either the private sector is not going to participate, or because the cities don't see it as their emergency, or because, on and on and on and on. And so I think, although, we're passionate about it and we're determined about it, I think there is wisdom in looking at the climate protection, whether it be mitigation or adaptation, as the result, but not as the reason, not the detonating reason. And the fantastic thing about climate protection is that actually you can pursue it via so many different channels. So one, organized or disorganized, whatever way you want to look at the UN, being organized or disorganized, you choose. But, the UN in all of its wisdom, with all of its governments, have looked at the development agenda for the next 15 years and identified 17 sustainable development goals. Well, think of them as just 17 different ways to pursue climate protection. So, and it has to be, the pursuit needs to be understood in the interest, in the immediate interest, not in the long term. Frankly, it needs to be in the immediate interest of whatever the actor is. So if we're dealing with health issues, then we should be looking at improving health through the lens of climate. If we're looking at cities, another SDG, we have to look at cities through the lens of climate. So it's using all of those. If we're looking at innovation, we have to look at innovation, low carbon, high resilient innovation. And you can go on down, the line of all of the different SDGs, or call them all of the different human pursuits. And what we have to understand is that climate is not a goal in and of itself. If you're the atmosphere, but none of us are, she does look at this as a pursuit on its own, but she's the only one. The rest of us need to pursue our goals, both on adaptation and on mitigation, through other channels, through the channels that make sense immediately to small cities, large cities, private sector, insurance companies, finance ministries, private finance. That's how you get going. And that is actually the wisdom that is embedded in the nationally determined contributions. Because before, what we had was what we called a top-down, in which we said, okay, here's what we have to do on climate, and now you take this responsibility, you take and that. Well, that didn't work. What we have understood is we have to really focus from the interest, frankly, from the interest and the urgency that is perceived by each country, by each city, by each private sector company, by each Ministry of Finance, what is hurting in their shoes, and then use that to pursue our climate goals. That is not necessarily going to get us to the global area that we need to get to the global results, but it certainly helps to begin to get us off this, planning, theoretical, legal text writing mode that we've been in for such a long time. Thank God that we're here, but we've got to, to echo Deborah, we've got to get now down to where the sun
So it's no
hits
good
the
any
panel.
longer beating people over the head with a climate change
No,
bottle.
it's not going to get us anywhere.
You have to appeal to absolutely what matters to them right now.
Yeah, what is going to make cities more livable? That's what people want to understand.
Yeah.
What is going to make their infrastructure, better infrastructure for the next 20, 30 years? That's what they want to know. What is going to improve our health? That's what they want to know. And climate is around all of that.
Roger, you outlined a lot of challenges earlier, but anything that you'd pick up on
So
that?
a couple things fairly clearly, and we talk about the link to the private sector and so on. But I'd like to propose that we don't have a sort of value proposition, but a values proposition. Because the reason why there's been this sort of disconnect has to do with the fact that we haven't coordinated on the common good that we're each after. And instead, there's a lot of mistrust on both sides regarding what goal are we after. Yes, there's a large room for insurance, but the state is itself the insurer of last resort. So we have to ask the question, what is the common good that we're working back from? As Christina was just saying, as we think through these issues, we can make the cost of adaptation be seen through the lenses of its benefits to all of these other areas, and adaptation itself being an outcome of better planning and practice, as opposed to a task on its own. From that standpoint, there's something, and it was mentioned just briefly, that we're sort of discounting. The fact that the people who are engaged on the ground in getting information, processes, organized, take a high degree of professional risk. Everyone in this room represents that community. It's not funded, it's not supported, it's only supported in part, yet it is a risk that takes on a dimension that changes the world that they're in. But it's not recognized with the same sort of support. So it's piecemeal. Many of the city planners who now we have in the city of Boulder, Colorado, where I live, which is almost its own state, thinks that every year their job is in question. This is a pragmatic issue. Who is engaged and how long are they doing this for? So I wanted to keep that in mind. There's one other issue that I'd like to raise, and we keep talking about the short and the long term, and we focus a lot on emergency management or integrated approaches that are into the long term, integrated coastal zone management, integrated water resources, but being able to mobilize resources right after an event that then help us plan for the long term, what is called the sovereign liquidity gap, the money that is pooled together to put long-term planning into practice. We haven't really thought through about where that pool is. We think in terms of emergency and we think in terms of long-term adaptation. But if the fundamental question is, how will our assumptions change in a changing environment, then the flexibility to bring capital to bear during an event is really critical.
Okay, very good. Now, we're already starting to get questions in via Mrs. Twitter, Cynthia in the second row there. I have a question from, it's Twitter handle, so I have no idea what your name is, but the Twitter handle is Alvaro Flying Rep. Where are you?
Flying Rep.
You may regret your Twitter handles now.
Oh, very good.
Okay, there you are over there. It's a question from Mark Watts. What way would you prescribe for mayors to win the argument and convince the general public?
Well, I think it's largely what Christiana has said. I mean, I should say actually in preface, because you asked us to describe challenges, so it makes the picture sound rather bleak, whereas actually I'd be relatively optimistic. I mean, compared to certainly a decade ago when C40 was being created and there were just one or two pioneer mayors like Ken Livingstone and Mike Bloomberg who really got climate change. Now it's absolutely the case that the leaders of the great world cities completely get the reason for climate action and know their role within it. So I don't think they need convincing, but I think the arguments that they need to employ more and we need to provide them with the evidence to make is that the things you need to do to tackle long-term climate change will make the city a much better place today. And we don't have to twist things to make that the case. When mayors are encouraging a shift away from private car usage to public transport to cycling and walking, it reduces air pollution, it makes travel faster within the city, it improves mobility for the worse off within the city, and it improves the economic performance of the city. And we really see that now in the evidence the new Climate Economy Commission has provided. You compare those well-designed, compact, dense, public transit-oriented cities in Scandinavia, like Copenhagen or a place like Rotterdam, with the North American model of sprawl and car-based, and the difference in proportion of spend of GDP on transport each year is about 4% versus 15%. So there's a huge economic premium. You don't need to mention climate change at all in motivating those actions, but it has a massive impact on reducing the carbon profile of the city.
Any other thoughts from you about how you go about persuading? Yeah, because you are in this situation. How do you go about persuading people?
Talking about my day job, I think what we have to be careful of is a top-down approach to action in cities with the assumption that the agency is always going to come out of City Hall. In fact, in the Global South, I would dare to say that it's the reverse. I would say that your powerhouse in the Global South cities is through civil society. And in fact, what we have to do is begin to democratize our climate planning processes to allow that civil voice to have a sense of agency in the plan, because I think often our most recalcitrant actors may in fact be in City Hall. So I would say that while there may be situations where the mayor, obviously from an economic efficiency point of view, here's the climate change argument, I would say there's a great need for civil democracy and for a rising up of the civil voice to engage with this idea that having a better quality of life in our cities is something that is going to tell at the ballot box. You know, I work with many traditional leaders. We come from a city where 2/3 of the land is rural. It's controlled by traditional leadership. They are so close, as that film indicated, to the problem. I don't need to persuade them of climate change. They're, in fact, ahead of the argumentation that I bring to them. So I think it's that democratization to allow these different voices, not just the mayors, but different voices to come into the decision-making in City Hall. And that's a tough challenge because governance systems are very hard to change.
So it needs to be a bottom-up approach. Once there is that bottom-up approach, it really focuses politicians' minds. I've got another question here from Guzma Sorensen. Where are you? Ah, there he is. Hello. And you can ask your question, because here I am with a
So this
mic.
was mainly addressed to Christiana. We have students in the audience today, and the question was, how do we inspire the next generations?
Well, that's a really, it's a really fundamental question because I think it has two sides. One is to be courageous enough to accept the fact that we are the first generation that has truly understood the consequences of what was happening before because our parents had no idea. So we have that responsibility. We have knowledge, we have science, we have the responsibility to begin to turn the boat around. At the same time, and that is our responsibility to the next generation, at the same time, the next generation is the first generation that enters the global economy because you and I didn't, with full knowledge of the fact that their environment has been forever changed, no matter how effective or ineffective the rest of us are. That environment is now completely changed. Now, it brings both opportunity and responsibility, right? Opportunity because honestly, the transformation that we're going to see, certainly in the energy sector, but also in construction and transportation, is fantastic. Absolutely fantastic. We're going to see transformation that, where what we have seen in the communications and computer sectors are nothing compared to the transformation that we're going to see in other sectors. So that opens up new jobs, new industries, new opportunities. That's a really exciting place for the new generation. And many people say, well, where is the new generation going to get jobs? Well, that's where they're going to get jobs. If we really do massive investment into both mitigation and adaptation, there's huge possibilities of jobs there. At the same time, they really need to understand that they don't have a choice. This is it. They have to help everyone else to choose that path. So, it's when you say inspiration, it's not lightly understood. There is a huge opportunity there, but there's also responsibility. So it's as you say in Spanish, un matizado. It's two-colored. It's a two-colored message to the next generation.
Quick word from you, Roger.
Yeah, so can I just add something to this? Because you used an interesting word, which is inspired. One of the critical efforts we've had is creating a professional master's course at the University of the West Indies in Barbados, where people come back in to then get some training to work in other communities. There's also now, from that standpoint, when we talk to students entering into this, and we ask, well, is it about your job? No, it's actually about the personal renaissance that happens when you realize you can make a contribution to making a difference. That's inspiration. From that standpoint, people like speaking, especially young folks, in the context of having a personal renaissance where they can rethink ideas. So I push them not to think about finding themselves in the world, but to creating a new world. This drives a lot of interest from the standpoint of students.
Now we have that actual thing. We do have students here. Where are they?
Yeah, it's a thing.
They are. And I'm going to pass
Cheap
them the
grad students, I think,
microphone.
is what she
How are we going to inspire you? Can you pass the microphone up there? So this is a bit mean of me, but...
It kind of is.
But you can cope, I know. These are super bright people. They can cope.
Oh, yeah, sure. Well, the thing I mostly expect of you and also the many people here, which we're only going to interview, is that from the reasons that you are here are different from the reasons we are here. And obviously, we need to het stokje overnemen, om het zo maar te zeggen. We need to receive everything that you've done, and then find a way to continue with your work, and hopefully make a better world for ourselves and our children as well. So when you put most of your effort into making a better world for us, we will make sure that we will create a better world for the people who come after us. That's the way you can inspire us all.
Thank you. So I hear that actually Twitter has slightly broken in here. It's obviously you're tweeting just way too much. So I'm going to take questions directly from the audience. Always dangerous, but I'm going to do it. Okay, so let's go over here. So tell us who you are.
Sure. My name is Monique Baskin. I'm a fellow at NOAA. So a question I have is, how do business services or business PPPs actually help in the implementation practice?
Yes, because it's implementation. You know, we're getting that message very strongly from you. It's all very well talking about implementation. We need to do it. Who's going to take that?
John.
John. Yes.
I knew there was a reason why I shouldn't have sat next to Christiana. You know, it's quite difficult when I talk to people who've come from an environmental background, who often have a lot of concerns about the way the private sector works. And I'm not here as an apologist of the private sector. I'm just being very pragmatic. But we have to talk to the private sector about profit, about bottom line, about turnover, about costs. You have to show what the business case is. If you can't show the business case to a business, and when I talk about the private sector, I'm talking about everything, and it's a bit of a weird term. I'm talking about everything from the subsistence farmer in Kenya who sells spare produce in the marketplace. That's private sector, all the way to the biggest corporate. It's all private sector. But if you can't show profit, yield, return, and no business case, there'll be no adaptation. And so we have to turn the risks, and Christina was talking about this, we have to turn this around and say, how do we make the world a better place? Because we understand climate change is now taking place. So when we're talking about something like PPPs, we've got to sit down, and PPPs are an interesting financial product because they only work if everybody who's a party to that, whether they're public or private sector, the insurance companies, the banks, everybody, and the customer, the consumer, all understand their individual risks and all understand that the risks are being shared and looked after. If there's a risk that's not managed, then the PPP falls apart. So how you engage the private sector, how you implement, is to sit down and have an honest discussion, taking account the world's going to be very different in the future, and the world's not like the past.
Can I just go on with that, follow up with a question from Chris Wright? Where is Chris Wright? Chris Wright? No, he's disappeared. He's gone away. We see $100 million of new tech fundraising every day, but the cost-benefit valuations of climate don't raise nearly enough. Why is that?
Because they're being talked about as climate, not talked about as business.
Exactly.
If I talk to, earlier on we were talking about Mark was talking about how do you talk to people, how to talk to the mayors. When we go into a private sector company, at one point we would talk about what are your risks, and we realised actually that's not very sexy, because all I'm doing is telling them there's another problem they've got to worry about. What they want to hear is opportunity. And the way we talk to a business is the same as the way we talk to a public sector, a government, or even a community. It's what are your existing worries? What are your existing problems? What are you trying to achieve? We can help you by helping you think how climate change interacts with that. So it's getting into, because then there's an immediacy. Then they're focused on what they want to do now, not something they think is longer term. So the way you attract investment is to talk about the now, talk about the business case. And there's plenty there. It's about flipping this around. The other point to make about this is we're using the wrong metrics when we talk to the world. The metrics of climate science are degrees C and millimetres of rainfall, etc., etc. That's understood. That's not the language of climate change. The language of climate change in the private sector is a dollar sign, and I don't think we should apologise for that. The language in the city is votes to the mayor. You know, those are metrics, and what we have to do is translate climate science into the specific language of climate change, depending on who your audience is. Otherwise, you're just talking climate science to them. So when I talk to business, I'm talking about dollars, because that's what they work on.
Roger, do you have that?
Yeah, from that standpoint, I mean, it is true that we tie things to the units, the currency in which we're dealing, whether it's dollars or institutional effectiveness. But I really think there's been a turning point with business that we're not acknowledging, which is the notion of shared responsibility that a lot of businesses are acknowledging, which moves us beyond this sort of, is it about dollars or is it about people? Because from the standpoint of people working in the public sector, we're after equity, procedural and distributive. And when someone comes in and says, well, we're after the dollar, well, who are you talking about in terms of their benefits? And I think we've turned the corner with many groups in the private sector where we're actually talking about shared risks and shared responsibilities. And that has been a change over the last few years. As someone just said, I really want us to keep in mind that while we're talking about challenges, I don't want to communicate to the audience that we have no successes in these areas. There's a lot of implementation going on. We've gone past that point, and I really think we need to acknowledge that. What we need, however, is what we're hearing is how do we draw out the experiences and the lessons from the things that we've put into place, like the pilot program on climate resilience, like many other efforts around the globe, that help us uncover the partnerships between the public sector, the private sector, communities, and we ask the question, who sustains the services into the long term? This is a critical question from the standpoint of those partnerships.
We've got a perfect person here to...
Can I just bring that back to the question about the next generation also, because something that I think is very impressive is the demand that is becoming every day more, every day louder about what kind of job and what kind of company do young people want to work for. And what I hear from millennials is they don't want to work for a company that, certainly they want to work for a company that is profitable, because otherwise they won't have a salary. But they also want to work for a company with a purpose. So, the new PPP that millennials are looking for is companies that believe in profit, people, and planet. That's the new 3PP. And it's very impressive because this is very much of a push and pull. Both companies and CEOs are beginning to understand this, and many of them were responsible for the success in Paris, but they're also responding to, they want to have the creme of the creme. They want to go to the best universities and have the best students. And those students are saying, I will work for you if you are a triple bottom line company. So it's a very interesting transformation that we're seeing, both on the corporate side as well as on the future employee side.
And hands up from our millennials in the audience here, if you agree with that. Yeah. Excuse me, some of you putting up hands up over there are a long, long way from being millennials. Even from over here, I can tell that. Right, so we have got here Habiba Gitaya of the World Bank, perfect person to answer some of those financial questions, and then I'll come over to that side.
Good morning. I used to be an academic not so long ago, but I decided to move towards not just talking about challenges, but actually finding solutions and seeing how people are implementing those solutions. So Roger actually started the point that I wanted to make, is that we are having this conversation almost like 5 years ago. Let's look at what communities are doing. I'm fortunate enough to work in Zambia and Samoa, and I don't see people waiting for climate information. They are taking actions on the ground. They are finding solutions because they don't have any choices. They are able to deal with the droughts and floods. So can the panel actually turn this around and maybe bring some practical examples that they're implementing instead of talking about the challenges that we have. We do have a couple of sessions this afternoon and on Thursday that will bring those practitioners' solutions in there. And I think that's the uniqueness of this meeting compared to others. But it would be nice to hear what the solutions are that you're seeing on the ground.
Okay, well, you have been challenged to put to not only talk the talk, but walk the walk. How about you? Let's start with you, Deborah.
And Habiba, thanks for opening that door. And again, so going back to my day job as a local government official, one of the very practical things we're doing in our city is a massive reforestation outreach. Obviously, Southern Africa is beset by an enormous drought at this point in time, so management of our catchment areas is critical. So areas that were previously taken up by sugarcane are now being reforested to improve quality, but we're doing that in terms of adding socioeconomic value to the associated rural communities. We're essentially rebuilding those forests. They become treepreneurs and can effectively then get credit notes that allow them to access building materials and build their own homes. So you've got a great value add system in there. We've also expanded that to begin to change patterns of governance because, as you know, politics only respects certain boundaries, and we're having to find innovative ways of creating partnerships across political boundaries so that we can own and manage catchments as a community rather than a set of political jigsaw puzzles. But the problem is, and I hear you because I see my own communities acting simply because they can and have to, is that there is a glass ceiling. We have to be very cautious of selling the message that communities will in fact solve their own problems. There is a very clear glass ceiling. You can only do so much. A community cannot build a large-scale wastewater treatment works. They can lay the pipes. But that integrated ecology, which requires us to make massive structural changes in our economy, in our governance systems, I think is something we're avoiding. And I hear all of these good things and drawing business to the table and so on, but we must be careful of selling these solutions as incremental and piecemeal, just doing a bit more of what we've done in a better way. In some cases, we're probably going to have to revolutionize and overthrow the systems, overthrow patterns of governance, of economies, challenge neoliberal capitalism as the modus operandi for dealing with global problems. And that's a debate that we're currently not having. Brave people need to have that debate because the inertia in the system is huge. So it's local action, but it has to be local action which is facilitated by some quite massive structural changes in parts of the world.
Mark, have you got a good example?
Yeah, well, I mean, I raised the issue of the need to demonstrate that adaptation and mitigation action can be taken together so that you don't get a trade-off between the two. And actually, I'm travelling on tomorrow to Rio de Janeiro in Brazil, which is where the chair of the C40 sits. And a really lovely example there is that they're as a result of changing patterns of cloudbursts in the rainy season, shifting to later in the day, Rio's been experiencing really extreme flood problems because it turned out the shift patterns of the waste collection workers ended in the afternoon before the major rainfall started to happen. So people would be putting out their rubbish, then the rains all come down, it all gets dragged down, blocked up the drains, which were then unable to cope with it, causing flooding as well as a spread of disease. Simply through changing, or in fact extending the shifts of the waste collection workers, they've both been able to significantly reduce the flood risk, actually significantly increase the amount of waste that they're collecting and able to recycle. And in Rio, emissions from waste are relatively high, 15% of their total. And it's also become a job creation program, employing people from some of the poorest parts of the city. So a nice kind of neat bringing together of all of those problems. But I think just to bring it back to a couple of the other points, so Deborah's correct point that we mustn't just talk about the top-down action from mayors, but it's also the bottom-up from community. In that case, it was led by community action, pushing the officials to do something about this problem rather than sticking rigidly to the way that things had already been done. But I think the issue is you have to have both the top-down and the bottom-up because time is just not on our side. And whilst it's a significant advantage to political leaders if they're able to, if they have communities that wish to organise and are working together and are pushing politicians and making things happen themselves. We don't have time for a community-led revolution to tackle climate change. We also need bold leadership. We don't have time to wait for bold leadership where it isn't. So we need both of them. And I think that also applies to the questions around the private sector. Because whilst I think it has been a tremendous step forward, the leadership that a number of business leaders have taken, particularly in Paris, and I think it's very genuine, still climate change is a product of fundamental market failure. And Jeff Sachs was saying this at a conference in Washington last week. There is no way there's going to be a pure market solution to climate change. We need good, tough regulation and planning from governments that makes it profitable to do good things and loss-making to do the bad things that have got us in this mess.
Okay, let's take a question from the audience. A short one, if you can, sir. And this is...
Atik Rahman, Bangladesh Center for Advanced Studies. I just wondered among the young people, and one of the questions often asked across the world is, what can the young people do? I think we as a generation who has successfully identified the problem, given some of the analytical tools, we haven't succeeded giving so many solution tools. So we have created a sort of helplessness or a fear among the younger generation who wants to do things and they feel frustrated not finding. They want to do something simple, one package that contributes to the solution. At the same time, hundreds of millions of poorest people are adapting. There is no money, no support, no government, no NGOs, nothing. They and the ocean in front of them, or they and the desert in front of them, or in Canada it's different. The whole city that had to move because of the severe burning, there has been support. But in developing countries, there is no such support. So people are doing it. The question is, how can we give some solutions which doesn't have to wait for the whole economic system to change, for all behavior of private sector, which will have to change and they become good guys? That, I think, if we have to wait for that sequentially, we have a problem of time, because time we don't have. So how do we square that and yet give hope to the generation coming? That is, I think,
Okay, and there's another question from Twitter, which is very much in the same vein, from Raisa Banfield, wherever you are. Hello. What do you think the fast-track way to cross from the global knowledge to local actions, which is very much in that same vein? Who wants to tackle that? Roger, I'm looking at you.
Hello. So, if we were to think through some of this and we ask, why have certain countries and communities sort of done well over time, irrespective of the changes, potential changes in climate? We'll pick a few things: healthcare, access to healthcare, nutrition, and education. Paying attention to those, I think, actually, in the context of the benefits, as was just being described, the fact that you're better off in the near term by paying attention to those questions in communities plays a big role. Now, of course, as I mentioned, the practical range of choice is dominated by our capacity, our communication, and our culture. How do we do this in the least prescriptive way possible? Because it's very easy to say, how do we act quickly? I also like to point out that acting quickly confuses decisiveness with good decisions. And we have to be very careful that we're not pushing ourselves into making short-term decisions that look like action. It basically, look busy. Focusing on things like on those three areas of healthcare, access to healthcare, of course, education, nutrition, gets us at people's capability. The reason why I mentioned education is not about whether or not people know their environment. It's knowing what they can do and what they can access to draw on. I really think the point that we're trying to get at here, there will be a lot of cases and a lot of depth coming out over the next few days. And I think we sort of misguide ourselves if we focus simply on a case, because it gives us the illusion that more is happening than is happening in terms of the coordination and what we're learning. A big part of what we want to be able to do is draw from those cases on what can be transferred to other places and what should not be transferred. There's an old saying, we're familiar with the six blind men and the elephant. It's a criticism of university departments. We each look at a piece of the thing and we don't know what the whole thing is. Well, 6 blind elephants will conclude a human being is flat. We will all agree on what the action is. We will all conclude that we know what we ought to do, but we set ourselves up for making the biggest mistake. As I mentioned before, our projections into the future are fraught with uncertainty. The issue, however, is are we ready for the surprises in the system? And that's where things like being able to pull together capital quickly. The only way it works is if we have access to healthcare, nutrition, and education. Windows present themselves, but bad ideas have windows too. And so we have to be very, very careful about rushing to action in the context of a changing world.